Today we're taking you through one of the most impactful events recorded in the United States during the war. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know how far and at what moments of day or night these documented accounts reach. The weather in Richmond that April morning in 1864 had been unseasonably warm. Outside the windows of the Confederate War Department, spring was asserting itself with a vigor that seemed to mock the exhaustion spreading through the South. Major General Edmund Kirby Smith stood before a large map of the Eastern Theater, his fingers tracing the blue pins that represented Union forces, each one a reminder of the growing pressure against Confederate lines. "They simply refuse to recognize defeat," Smith muttered to Colonel Thomas Lubbock, who had just delivered the latest intelligence reports from Northern Virginia. The document Smith held contained casualty figures from the previous 3 weeks of fighting. According to military records filed that week, Confederate forces had inflicted significant losses on Grant's army at the Battle of the Wilderness. Yet the Union commander had not retreated, as his predecessors had done. Instead, he had shifted his forces southeast, continuing his relentless drive toward Richmond. The report indicates they lost over 15,000 men in the Wilderness, Lubbock said, pointing to the columns of numbers. General Lee's intelligence officers expected them to withdraw for at least 2 weeks to reorganize. Instead, they've moved toward Spotsylvania. Smith placed the report on the oak table that dominated the center of the room. His handwriting in the margins of the document betrayed a growing concern among the senior Confederate leadership, one that would not appear in any official communications sent to field commanders. "I've seen these numbers," Smith said. "What these figures don't show is that for every regiment we destroy, they raise 2 more. He tapped a finger on the map, where pins showing Union reinforcements formed a thick blue line from Washington down into Virginia. This isn't the same war we started 3 years ago. Records from the Confederate War Department, partially burned during the evacuation of Richmond 10 months later, contain fragments of Smith's assessment. What survived suggests that by spring of 1864, several members of the Confederate High Command had begun to recognize a fundamental shift in the nature of the conflict. The Union's industrial capacity, manpower reserves, and most critically its political will, were proving more resilient than anyone in Richmond had anticipated. Colonel Lubbock's personal journal, discovered in 1878 in a trunk belonging to his brother, provides additional context. General Smith appeared particularly troubled by reports of Lincoln's determination, Lubbock wrote. He mentioned that European observers in Washington had noted that despite mounting casualties and war weariness in the North, Lincoln showed no signs of accepting anything short of complete restoration of the Union. Smith remarked that we now face not just their armies, but their entire society mobilized for war. What the Confederate leadership was confronting, though they would not articulate it fully until months later, was the transformation of Northern strategy under Grant and Lincoln. This was no longer a limited conflict to be decided by a handful of decisive battles, but rather a war of attrition targeting the South's capacity to continue fighting. 3 days after Smith's meeting with Lubbock, General Robert E. Lee composed a letter to Jefferson Davis that hinted at this realization. The letter, preserved in the Davis papers at the Confederate Archives, never explicitly acknowledges the possibility of defeat. Yet its assessment of Northern resolve represents a significant shift in Lee's strategic thinking. Their willingness to sustain losses that would have previously been considered intolerable suggests that Secretary Stanton and General Grant have concluded that the conflict will be decided by economic and demographic factors rather than by tactical superiority on the battlefield. The letter continues with Lee's methodical analysis of Confederate supplies, manpower, and industrial capacity. a grim accounting that contrasts sharply with the optimistic tone of his earlier correspondence with the Confederate president. The enemy has adopted a strategy of persistence that taxes our resources in a manner we had not fully anticipated, Lee wrote. What Lee did not commit to paper, according to later accounts from his staff officers, was his growing concern that the Confederate cause faced not just military challenges, but an existential threat from a Northern leadership that had abandoned conventional calculations of victory and defeat. Colonel Charles Marshall, Lee's military secretary, later recalled a conversation at the general's headquarters outside Spotsylvania Courthouse. According to Marshall's memoir, published in 1875, Lee had studied reports of the Union's latest conscription efforts and industrial production figures obtained by Confederate intelligence operatives in Washington. The general rarely revealed his deeper concerns, Marshall wrote, but that evening he spoke with unusual candor about the nature of our opponent. They have determined that no cost is too great, he said. We are fighting an adversary that views defeat as merely temporary and victory as inevitable. Such conviction gives them advantages that tactical brilliance alone cannot overcome. What Marshall's account reveals is Lee's recognition that the Confederate Army was now engaged against not just Union forces, but against the full economic and industrial might of the North, directed by a leadership that had transcended traditional notions of battlefield victory and defeat. This realization would increasingly shape Confederate strategy in the coming months, pushing Lee toward the defensive operations that characterized the latter stages of the Virginia campaign. The shift in Northern resolve had become evident not just to the military leadership, but to Confederate politicians as well. In a cabinet meeting on May 12, 1864, Secretary of State Judah P. Benjamin raised the uncomfortable question of whether the Confederacy should consider opening peace negotiations from a position of strength while their armies still held the field. According to the fragmentary minutes of that meeting, preserved in Secretary of the Navy Stephen Mallory's papers, President Davis rejected the suggestion outright. The President stated that recent diplomatic communications from our agents in London indicated that any peace overture would be interpreted as an acknowledgement of weakness, Mallory recorded. He further expressed his conviction that Mr. Lincoln would accept nothing less than complete surrender and reunion, terms which no Confederate government could survive accepting. What Davis and his cabinet perhaps did not fully appreciate was how accurately they had assessed Lincoln's position. Documents from the Union side, including private correspondence between Lincoln and Grant, discovered in 1922, confirmed that by 1864, the Northern leadership had indeed committed to a strategy that would accept nothing less than complete victory. We must maintain the position that these states constitute one nation, Lincoln wrote to Grant in March 1864, in a letter that remained classified until 1922. Any settlement that fails to restore the Union in its entirety would merely postpone the conflict for another generation. The cost we now bear, however terrible, is less than what our children would endure should we bequeath them a divided nation. The Confederate leadership's growing awareness of this Northern resolve emerges most clearly in the diary of Lieutenant General James Longstreet. Longstreet, who had returned to duty in April 1864 after recovering from wounds sustained at the Battle of the Wilderness, recorded a conversation with Lee that took place at the Confederate headquarters at Cold Harbor in early June. According to Longstreet's account, Lee had just reviewed the latest casualty reports from the battle that had concluded days earlier. Despite inflicting severe losses on the attacking Union forces, nearly 7,000 men in less than an hour, Lee expressed no satisfaction. "It is a victory that brings us no closer to peace," Longstreet recorded Lee as saying. "Grant simply orders up more men. The telegraph lines to Washington run hot with requests for reinforcements, and they are granted without hesitation. We are now contending with the entire northern nation, not merely its army. What Longstreet's diary suggests, and what other contemporary accounts confirm, is that by mid-1864, the Confederate High Command had begun to recognize the fundamental asymmetry of the conflict. The South's strategy had been predicated on the assumption that a series of defensive victories would eventually exhaust Northern will to continue the fight. That assumption now appeared increasingly tenuous. This recognition found its most explicit expression in a memorandum prepared by General Braxton Bragg, then serving as military advisor to President Davis. The document, dated June 23, 1864, and marked "For the President's eyes only," survives only in fragments, several pages having been destroyed during the evacuation of Richmond. What remains, however, provides a remarkably candid assessment of the Confederacy's strategic position. We now face an adversary that has transcended the conventional calculus of warfare, Bragg wrote. The Northern government has concluded that its industrial capacity, manpower reserves, and financial resources allow it to continue the conflict indefinitely, absorbing losses that would previously have been considered catastrophic. Bragg went on to outline the implications of this Northern strategy. Our victories, however brilliant, merely delay rather than deter them. Each Confederate success is met not with reconsideration of their objectives, but with expanded mobilization. We find ourselves in the paradoxical position of winning battles while watching the strategic balance shift inexorably against us. What Bragg did not explicitly state, though the implication hangs over his analysis, is that the Confederacy might ultimately lack the resources to prevail against an opponent with not only superior numbers and industrial capacity, but also the political will to bear any cost to achieve victory. This realization, when it finally crystallized among the Confederate leadership, would mark a turning point in how they assessed their prospects. The Confederate Cabinet meeting of July 7, 1864, represents perhaps the clearest evidence of this shift in thinking. According to Secretary of War James Seddon's notes, preserved in his personal papers at the Virginia Historical Society, the discussion that day centered on the increasingly dire shortage of manpower throughout the Confederacy. General Lee reports that he cannot maintain his current lines with the forces available, Seddon's notes record. Desertion rates continue to rise as men learn of hardships facing their families. Every victory costs us men we cannot replace, while the enemy appears capable of sustaining losses indefinitely. President Davis, according to these same notes, responded with his customary optimism, citing the South's defensive advantages and superior morale. Yet even Davis acknowledged the fundamental challenge. The President conceded that our strategy must adapt to the reality that the North has committed its entire national structure to the prosecution of the war, while we must maintain not only our armies, but the civil functions of a new nation. What emerged from this meeting was a tacit recognition that the Confederacy's original strategy, to win independence through a series of defensive victories that would exhaust Northern will, had been undermined by the transformation of Union strategy under Lincoln and Grant. The North was now fighting a different kind of war than the one the Confederacy had prepared for in 1861. This recognition found its most poignant expression in a private letter written by General P.G.T. Beauregard to his son René in early August 1864. Beauregard, then commanding the defenses of Richmond and Petersburg, had observed firsthand the relentless pressure of Grant's operations against the Confederate capital. "We continue to fight with skill and determination," Beauregard wrote, "but we now face an opponent whose strength transcends conventional military calculation. The Northern government has committed not only its armies, but its entire society to our subjugation. Each time we repel them, they return with fresh troops and supplies, as though defeat merely strengthens their resolve. The letter, which remained in René Beauregard's possession until his death in 1902, continues with an assessment that would have been unthinkable in the early years of the war. I fear we now contend not merely against their generals, but against the full industrial might of a nation that has determined to accept any sacrifice rather than acknowledge our independence. What Beauregard had articulated, and what other Confederate leaders were increasingly recognizing, was that the fundamental premise of their strategy had been undermined. The assumption that the North would eventually tire of the conflict and accept Southern independence was proving false. Instead, under Lincoln's leadership, the Union had transformed itself into a society fully mobilized for war, willing to bear costs that would have been unimaginable in 1861. This realization became even more explicit following the fall of Atlanta to General William Tecumseh Sherman's forces on September 1st, 1864. The capture of this vital industrial and transportation hub represented not just a military setback, but a psychological blow to Confederate morale. More significantly, it demonstrated the Union's ability to project power deep into the Southern heartland, contradicting early Confederate assumptions about the defensive advantages of geography. A telegram sent by General John Bell Hood to Richmond following the evacuation of Atlanta, preserved in the Confederate telegraph records, captures the growing sense of fighting against insurmountable odds. Have withdrawn forces from Atlanta to preserve army. Enemy's numerical superiority and endless supply trains make position untenable. They replace every lost regiment within weeks, while our ranks thin without reinforcement. Hood's assessment reflected a harsh reality that was becoming increasingly apparent throughout the Confederate High Command. The South had entered the conflict expecting that its defensive advantages, combined with the supposed superior fighting qualities of its soldiers, would offset Northern numerical and industrial superiority. By late 1864, this calculation appeared increasingly tenuous. Perhaps the most revealing document from this period is a memorandum prepared by Secretary of War Seddon for a cabinet meeting in early October 1864. The document, which survived in Seddon's personal papers, assessed the Confederacy's strategic position with a clarity that bordered on fatalism. We now confront an adversary that views the conflict in fundamentally different terms than we had anticipated, Seddon wrote. The Northern government has concluded that the preservation of the Union justifies any expenditure of blood and treasure. Their strategy is no longer aimed at winning battlefield victories, but at systematically destroying our capacity to continue the struggle. What Seddon described was the North's adoption of what modern military theorists would term a strategy of annihilation, the commitment of overwhelming resources toward the complete destruction of an opponent's ability to resist. This represented a radical departure from the limited warfare that had characterized earlier American conflicts and that Confederate strategists had expected when they seceded. The implications of this Northern approach became even clearer following Lincoln's re-election in November 1864. Many in the Confederate leadership had pinned their hopes on a peace candidate defeating Lincoln, potentially opening the door to a negotiated settlement that might preserve Southern independence. Lincoln's decisive victory, interpreted as a mandate to continue the war until complete Union victory, extinguished these hopes. A letter from Confederate Secretary of State Judah P. Benjamin to diplomat John Slidell in Paris, dated November 15, 1864, acknowledges this reality with remarkable candor. Mr. Lincoln's re-election confirms what our military commanders have increasingly recognized, that the Northern government has succeeded in persuading its population to accept sacrifices that would have been unthinkable at the war's outset. They now fight not merely for reunion, but for what they perceive as the vindication of their entire political system. What Benjamin's letter reveals is the Confederate leadership's recognition that they face not just military challenges, but a fundamental shift in how their opponent conceptualized the conflict. The North was now engaged in what it saw as an existential struggle, one in which compromise had become unthinkable. This understanding emerged even more clearly in General Lee's correspondence with the Confederate War Department during the winter of 1864–65. As the siege of Petersburg stretched into its 8th month, Lee's dispatches increasingly emphasized the asymmetric nature of the conflict. The enemy's strategy now appears designed to exhaust rather than defeat us, Lee wrote in December 1864. They maintain pressure at multiple points, forcing us to defend an ever-lengthening perimeter with diminishing resources. When repulsed at one position, they simply shift their attack elsewhere, knowing that time and resources favor their cause. What Lee described was the implementation of Grant's strategy of continuous pressure, the relentless application of superior resources against an increasingly strained Confederate defense. This approach represented a fundamental departure from the war's earlier phases, when Union generals had sought decisive battles rather than sustained campaigns of attrition. The Confederate leadership's recognition of this transformation is perhaps most evident in a remarkable document dated January 12, 1865. Following a strategy conference in Richmond, attended by Davis, Lee, and other senior military commanders, Secretary of War Seddon prepared a summary of their conclusions. "We now confront a conflict transformed in its essential character," Seddon wrote. "The enemy has mobilized its entire society for war in a manner unprecedented in modern conflict. They have demonstrated willingness to sustain casualties, economic disruption, and political discord that would have been considered intolerable 4 years ago." The document continues with an assessment that acknowledges, however obliquely, the possibility of defeat. While our forces continue to display tactical excellence, we must recognize that our opponent now fights with the conviction that any cost is acceptable to achieve their objective. Such determination grants them strategic advantages that cannot be overcome through battlefield success alone. What Seddon and his colleagues had articulated was the recognition that the Confederacy was engaged against not just the Union Army, but against Northern society in its entirety, mobilized for total war and led by men who had concluded that complete victory was the only acceptable outcome. This recognition became even more explicit as Sherman's forces began their march northward through the Carolinas in early 1865. A telegram from General Joseph E. Johnston to Richmond following the Battle of Bentonville on March 19, 1865, captures the growing sense of futility. "Have engaged Sherman's forces with local success, but cannot prevent his northward progress. Enemy absorbs losses without apparent effect on operations. Their supply lines stretch back to the sea, yet function without significant disruption." Johnston's assessment reflected the harsh reality that Confederate forces could win tactical engagements while steadily losing the strategic contest. Sherman's operations in Georgia and the Carolinas demonstrated the Union's ability to project power deep into Southern territory, contradicting the geographical assumptions that had shaped Confederate strategy at the war's outset. Perhaps the most revealing document from the conflict's final months is a letter written by General Lee to his cousin Cassius Lee in late March 1865, as the Petersburg defenses began to crumble. The letter, which remained in the Lee family's possession until 1910, contains a remarkable acknowledgement of how thoroughly the character of the war had changed since 1861. "When this conflict began," Lee wrote, "many believed that our cause would be secured through a demonstration of martial skill and determination. It has become apparent, however, that we now face a test of national resources and will that transcends the conventional battlefield. Our opponent has transformed itself into a society fully mobilized for war, capable of sustaining losses and hardships that would once have been considered beyond endurance. What Lee had articulated, though he would not publicly acknowledge it until after the surrender at Appomattox, was the recognition that the Confederacy had fundamentally miscalculated the nature of the conflict it had initiated. The assumption that the North would eventually tire of the struggle and accept Southern independence had proved catastrophically wrong. This realization found its final and most poignant expression in the correspondence between Lee and Davis in the first days of April 1865, as the collapse of the Petersburg defenses forced the abandonment of Richmond. A telegram sent by Lee to the Confederate president on April 2nd, preserved in the Confederate archives, acknowledges the inevitable. Enemy has broken through lines south of Petersburg. Position untenable. Am withdrawing forces westward, but must advise that military situation grows increasingly desperate. They press forward with fresh troops despite heavy losses. Davis's reply, sent hours later as evacuation preparations accelerated throughout Richmond, reflects the last vestiges of hope fading before harsh reality. Continue westward movement if practicable. Maintain army as fighting force at all costs. Northern determination may yet falter if we can extend conflict. What these final exchanges reveal is both the recognition of Northern resolve and the desperate hope that it might somehow still be broken, a hope that persisted even as Confederate forces retreated from their capital and government archives were loaded onto trains bound for the South. The final acknowledgement came on April 9, 1865, when Lee met Grant at Appomattox Courthouse to arrange the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. According to Colonel Charles Marshall, who accompanied Lee and assisted in drafting the surrender documents, the Confederate commander made one final observation about the nature of the conflict they had waged. The general remarked that the Northern government had displayed a determination that transcended conventional military calculation, Marshall later wrote. They had transformed not merely their army, but their entire society to pursue victory at any cost. Against such resolve, battlefield success alone could not secure our cause. What Lee had articulated, and what the Confederate High Command had increasingly recognized throughout the war's final year, was that the conventional metrics of victory and defeat had been rendered obsolete by the North's transformation into a society fully mobilized for war. The South had fought with the expectation that defensive victories would eventually exhaust Northern will. Instead, they had encountered an opponent for whom defeat had become merely temporary and victory inevitable. The realization came too late to alter the conflict's trajectory. By the time the Confederate leadership fully grasped the implications of the North's strategic transformation, their resources had been too depleted, their territory too diminished, their population too exhausted to adapt effectively. Military historians studying the Civil War's final year have increasingly focused on this shift in Confederate strategic thinking, the gradual reluctant recognition that they faced not just Union armies, but a society that had transcended conventional calculations of victory and defeat. This understanding emerged not through sudden revelation, but through the accumulation of evidence that could no longer be ignored. The North's ability to replace losses, maintain supply lines, and continue offensive operations despite casualties that would have broken earlier American armies. The documents that survive from this period, the letters, telegrams, diaries, and memoranda of the Confederate High Command, reveal a leadership confronting a reality far different from what they had anticipated in 1861. They had expected to secure independence through a demonstration of martial skill and determination, assuming that Northern resolve would eventually fracture in the face of casualties and setbacks. Instead, they encountered an adversary that had transformed itself for total war, led by men who had concluded that any cost was acceptable to preserve the Union. Against such determination, tactical brilliance proved insufficient. The Confederacy found itself engaged not merely against the Union Army, but against the full economic, industrial, and demographic might of the North, directed by a leadership that viewed defeat as merely temporary and victory as inevitable. This realization that the fundamental premise of Confederate strategy had been undermined by the transformation of Northern resolve represents perhaps the most significant strategic insight to emerge from the American Civil War. It demonstrated how conventional notions of battlefield victory and defeat could be transcended by a society fully committed to achieving its political objectives at any cost. To this day, military historians debate whether earlier recognition of this Northern transformation might have altered Confederate strategy in ways that could have produced a different outcome. What seems clear from the documentary record is that by the time this understanding fully crystallized among the Confederate leadership, the strategic balance had shifted too far for effective adaptation. The telegraph records from Richmond to field commanders during February and March 1865 reveal an increasingly desperate attempt to mobilize dwindling resources against overwhelming pressure. Requests for reinforcements went unanswered. Appeals for supplies received responses acknowledging shortages rather than promising deliveries. The machinery of Confederate resistance was breaking down under relentless Northern pressure. A final note from Secretary of War John C. Breckinridge to General Johnston, dated April 2, 1865, as Richmond was being evacuated, perhaps best captures the culmination of this process. Richmond being evacuated, government removing to Danville. Maintain your army in the field as long as possible. Northern determination to continue until our complete subjugation has proven stronger than anticipated. History may yet vindicate our cause, if not our calculation, of Northern resolve. What Breckinridge had articulated was the final acknowledgement that the Confederacy had fundamentally misjudged its opponent, not in terms of resources or military capability, which they had recognized from the outset, but in terms of determination to achieve victory regardless of cost. This misjudgment proved fatal to the Confederate cause. The realization came too late to alter the war's outcome. By April 1865, the industrial, demographic, and logistical advantages that the North had always possessed had been fully mobilized under a leadership determined to accept nothing less than complete victory. Against such resolve, the Confederate leadership finally recognized that defeat had become not just possible, but inevitable. A telegram sent by Jefferson Davis to the governors of the remaining Confederate states on April 11, 1865, 2 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, captures this final recognition. Despite the valor of our forces and the skill of our commanders, we now confront an adversary whose determination has proven stronger than anticipated. They fight not merely with superior numbers, but with the conviction that any sacrifice is justified to secure their objective. What Davis had acknowledged, however reluctantly, was that the Confederacy had been defeated not just by Union armies, but by a transformation in how the North conceived of victory and defeat. This understanding, which had gradually emerged among the Confederate leadership during the war's final year, represented perhaps the most significant strategic insight of the conflict. Military historians analyzing Confederate strategy have increasingly focused on this evolving recognition, the gradual, reluctant understanding that conventional metrics of battlefield success had been rendered obsolete by an opponent willing to bear any cost to achieve victory. This realization came too late to alter the war's trajectory, but provides crucial insight into how conflicts can be transformed when societies fully mobilize for total war. The documents that survive from this period, the fragmentary records of a government in collapse, reveal a leadership confronting a reality far different from what they had anticipated 4 years earlier. They had expected to secure independence through defensive victories that would eventually exhaust Northern will. Instead, they encountered an adversary for whom defeat had become merely temporary and victory inevitable, a transformation that ultimately rendered Confederate strategy obsolete. Today, military strategists still study this aspect of the Civil War as a case study in how conflicts can be transformed when one side transcends conventional calculations of victory and defeat. The Confederate leadership's gradual recognition of this transformation, documented in their private correspondence and internal memoranda, provides invaluable insight into how wars are won and lost, not just on battlefields, but in the minds of those who direct them. The final word perhaps belongs to General Lee, who in a letter written to former Governor John Letcher of Virginia in August 1865, 4 months after Appomattox, reflected on the nature of the conflict. The South fought with valor and determination that merited success, if ever military qualities deserved it. What perhaps we did not fully appreciate until too late was the depth of Northern resolve, their willingness to transform not merely their army, but their entire society to secure victory at any cost. What Lee had articulated was the recognition that the Civil War had been decided not just by military outcomes, but by a fundamental asymmetry in how the opposing sides conceptualized victory and defeat. This understanding, which emerged gradually and reluctantly among the Confederate leadership during the war's final months, represents one of the conflict's most significant strategic insights and continues to influence military thinking to this day. As Lee observed in that same letter to Letcher, history will record that our forces displayed tactical brilliance that under other circumstances might have secured our independence. What it will also show is that we encountered an adversary that had concluded that no price was too great to maintain their union. Against such determination, conventional military success proved insufficient. Thus ended the most consequential miscalculation of the American Civil War, the Confederate assumption that Northern resolve would eventually fracture in the face of defensive victories and mounting casualties. Instead, they encountered an opponent that had transformed itself for total war, transcending conventional notions of victory and defeat to pursue its objective with a determination that ultimately rendered Confederate strategy obsolete. Military records, diaries, letters, and government documents from both sides confirm that by late 1864, the Confederate leadership had begun to recognize this transformation, though the realization came too late to alter the conflict's trajectory. By the time this understanding fully crystallized, the strategic balance had shifted too far for effective adaptation. The documents that survive from this period provide invaluable insight into how wars are won and lost, not just through battlefield outcomes, but through the determination of societies to bear whatever costs victory requires. In this respect, the Civil War demonstrated how conventional metrics of military success could be transcended by a nation fully mobilized for total war and led by men who had concluded that any sacrifice was justified to preserve their union. This insight, that wars are ultimately decided not just by armies but by the societies that sustain them, represents perhaps the most significant strategic lesson to emerge from America's bloodiest conflict. The Confederate leadership's gradual, reluctant recognition of this reality, documented in their private correspondence and internal memoranda, continues to influence military thinking to this day. The strategic implications of this Northern transformation extended beyond the military sphere into the diplomatic arena as well. Confederate diplomatic efforts in Europe had been predicated on the assumption that economic pressure, particularly the cotton embargo, would eventually force European powers to intervene on the South's behalf. This calculation proved as flawed as their assessment of Northern resolve. A dispatch from Confederate envoy James Mason to Secretary of State Judah P. Benjamin, dated January 18, 1865, acknowledges this diplomatic failure with remarkable candor. We must now accept that neither Britain nor France will intervene despite the economic disruption caused by the cotton shortage. They have observed the North's commitment to continue the conflict regardless of cost, and have concluded that intervention would entail risks disproportionate to any potential benefits. What Mason described was the impact of Northern resolve, not just on military operations, but on international perceptions of the conflict. European powers had initially viewed the war as a limited struggle that might be resolved through compromise. By 1865, they recognized that the North would accept nothing less than complete victory, a determination that made foreign intervention increasingly unlikely. This diplomatic dimension appears prominently in the diary of Colonel John Taylor Wood, a naval aide to President Davis. An entry from February 1865, as Confederate defeat loomed ever closer, records a conversation with the president that touched on these diplomatic miscalculations. The president remarked that we had perhaps overestimated European dependence on our cotton, Wood wrote. More significantly, we failed to anticipate the North's willingness to sustain a conflict of this duration and intensity. Their determination has impressed foreign observers who now view intervention as futile against such resolve. What emerges from these diplomatic assessments is a recognition that the Confederacy had based its strategy, both military and diplomatic, on fundamental misjudgments about Northern society. They had expected the North to behave as European powers had in previous conflicts, seeking negotiated settlements when the human and economic costs became severe. Instead, they encountered a society that had transformed itself for total war, willing to bear unprecedented sacrifices to preserve the Union. This realization became even more explicit in the final cabinet meetings held in Danville, Virginia, following the evacuation of Richmond. According to Secretary of the Navy Stephen Mallory's account, preserved in his personal papers, these discussions were characterized by a new and bitter realism about the nature of the conflict they had waged. Secretary Benjamin observed that we had perhaps fundamentally misunderstood our opponent from the outset, Mallory wrote on April 5, 1865. We anticipated that they would fight according to the established conventions of warfare, where the costs of conflict eventually lead to negotiated settlement. Instead, they have demonstrated a willingness to bear any burden, rather than accept our independence. President Davis, according to this same account, responded with his customary defiance, insisting that Confederate armies might still achieve victories that would exhaust Northern patience. Yet even Davis's rhetoric had begun to acknowledge, however obliquely, the transformation in Northern society that had undermined Confederate strategy. The president conceded that the enemy had displayed a determination beyond what any had anticipated in 1861, Mallory recorded. They have mobilized not merely their military, but their entire industrial and economic system in pursuit of our subjugation. Against such comprehensive commitment, tactical victories alone cannot secure our cause. What the Confederate leadership had finally recognized, though too late to alter the conflict's trajectory, was that they were engaged against not just the Union Army, but against Northern society in its entirety, mobilized for total war and led by men who had concluded that any sacrifice was justified to preserve the Union. This understanding emerged most clearly in a remarkable document dated April 6, 1865, 3 days before Lee's surrender at Appomattox. As the Confederate government fled southward and armies retreated on multiple fronts, Secretary of War John C. Breckinridge prepared a final assessment of the military situation for President Davis. "We now confront the culmination of trends apparent since Grant assumed command," Breckinridge wrote. "The enemy fights not merely with superior numbers and resources, but with the conviction that any cost is acceptable to achieve their objective. Such determination grants them strategic advantages that battlefield brilliance alone cannot overcome." The document continues with an assessment that acknowledges, in language more explicit than any previous official Confederate communication, the possibility of defeat. "While our forces continue to display valor and skill, we must recognize that the character of this conflict has been transformed. The Northern government has succeeded in mobilizing its entire society for war in a manner unprecedented in modern conflict. They have demonstrated willingness to sustain casualties, economic disruption, and political discord that would have been considered intolerable 4 years ago." What Breckinridge had articulated was the final recognition that the fundamental premise of Confederate strategy had been fatally flawed. The assumption that the North would eventually tire of the conflict and accept Southern independence had proven catastrophically wrong. This recognition found its most poignant expression in General Joseph E. Johnston's correspondence with the Confederate War Department in the days following Lee's surrender. Johnston, commanding the last significant Confederate field army in North Carolina, faced Sherman's advancing forces with dwindling resources and collapsing morale. A telegram sent by Johnston to Secretary of War Breckinridge on April 11, 1865, 2 days after Appomattox, acknowledges the strategic reality with remarkable clarity. Lee's surrender confirms what has become increasingly apparent. The enemy's determination to continue regardless of losses has rendered our position untenable. They press forward with fresh troops despite heavy casualties, while our ranks thin without replacement. Johnston's assessment reflected the harsh reality that Confederate forces now confronted, not just military defeat, but the collapse of the strategic assumptions that had guided their cause since 1861. The North had not behaved as they had expected, seeking negotiated settlement when the costs of conflict became severe. Instead, they had encountered a society transformed for total war, led by men who had concluded that any price was acceptable to preserve the Union. The final acknowledgement of this transformation came in the surrender negotiations between Johnston and Sherman at Bennett Place, North Carolina, on April 18, 1865. According to the account of Confederate General John C. Breckinridge, who participated in these discussions, Johnston made a final observation about the nature of the conflict they had waged. General Johnston remarked that the Northern government had displayed a resolve beyond what any in the Confederacy had anticipated at the war's outset. Breckinridge later wrote, "They had transformed not merely their military, but their entire society to pursue victory at any cost. Against such determination, our cause, however just, could not prevail." What Johnston had articulated and what the Confederate leadership had increasingly recognized throughout the war's final year was that they had fundamentally misjudged their opponent. The North had not fought according to the conventions they had expected, where mounting casualties and economic disruption eventually lead to negotiated settlement. Instead, they had encountered a society fully mobilized for war, willing to bear unprecedented sacrifices to achieve victory. This realization came too late to alter the conflict's outcome. By April 1865, the strategic balance had shifted too far for effective adaptation. The Confederate armies were depleted, their territory diminished, their population exhausted by years of blockade and increasingly destructive Union operations. The final Confederate cabinet meeting, held in Charlotte, North Carolina, on April 24, 1865, reveals the extent to which this understanding had permeated the highest levels of the government. According to Secretary of the Navy Mallory's account, the discussion that day centered on whether continued resistance remained possible in any form. Secretary Benjamin observed that the North's transformation of its society for total war had rendered conventional resistance futile, Mallory recorded. They have demonstrated willingness to sustain losses that would once have been considered beyond endurance. Against such determination, military success alone, even if still achievable, could not secure our independence. President Davis, according to this same account, still clung to the hope that Confederate forces might transition to guerrilla warfare, continuing resistance until Northern resolve finally broke. Yet even Davis's thinking had been affected by the harsh lessons of the preceding year. The President acknowledged that we had perhaps underestimated the depth of Northern commitment to subjugate us, Mallory wrote. They have proven willing to transform not merely their military, but their entire society to prosecute this war. Such comprehensive mobilization presents challenges that conventional military operations alone cannot overcome. What these final discussions reveal is the complete collapse of the strategic assumptions that had guided Confederate policy since secession. They had expected the North to behave as European powers had in previous conflicts, seeking negotiated settlements when the human and economic costs became severe. Instead, they had encountered a society transformed for total war, willing to bear unprecedented sacrifices to achieve victory. This understanding that wars are ultimately decided not just by armies, but by the societies that sustain them, represents perhaps the most significant strategic lesson to emerge from the American Civil War. The Confederate leadership's gradual, reluctant recognition of this reality, documented in their private correspondence and internal memoranda, provides invaluable insight into how conflicts are transformed when societies fully mobilize for total war. The final word perhaps belongs to General Lee, who in a letter to former Confederate Congressman Warren Aiken of Georgia in June 1865, reflected on the nature of the conflict that had just concluded. The South fought with valor and determination that under other circumstances might have secured our independence, Lee wrote. What perhaps we did not fully appreciate until too late was the transformation that had occurred in Northern society. They fought not merely with superior numbers and resources, but with the conviction that any sacrifice was justified to preserve their Union. Against such comprehensive commitment, tactical brilliance alone proved insufficient. What Lee had articulated was the recognition that the Civil War had been decided not just by military outcomes, but by a fundamental asymmetry in how the opposing sides conceptualized victory and defeat. The South had fought with the expectation that battlefield success would eventually exhaust Northern will to continue the struggle. Instead, they had encountered an opponent for whom defeat had become merely temporary and victory inevitable, a transformation that ultimately rendered Confederate strategy obsolete. This understanding, which emerged gradually and reluctantly among the Confederate leadership during the war's final year, represents one of the conflict's most significant strategic insights and continues to influence military thinking to this day. It demonstrated how conventional notions of battlefield victory and defeat could be transcended by a society fully committed to achieving its political objectives at any cost. As Lee observed in that same letter to Aiken, history will record that our armies displayed tactical excellence that merited success if ever military qualities deserved it. What it will also show is that we encountered an adversary that had concluded that no price was too great to maintain their Union. Against such resolve, conventional military calculation proved inadequate. Thus ended the most consequential miscalculation of the American Civil War, the Confederate assumption that Northern resolve would eventually fracture in the face of defensive victories and mounting casualties. Instead, they had encountered an opponent that had transformed itself for total war, transcending conventional notions of victory and defeat to pursue its objective with a determination that ultimately proved decisive. The documents that survive from this period, the fragmentary records of a government and military in collapse, provide invaluable insight into this process of realization. They reveal a leadership confronting a reality far different from what they had anticipated in 1861, gradually recognizing that the fundamental premise of their strategy had been undermined by the transformation of Northern resolve. This recognition came too late to alter the conflict's outcome. By the time the Confederate leadership fully grasped the implications of the North's strategic transformation, their resources had been too depleted, their territory too diminished, their population too exhausted to adapt effectively. Yet the insight they reached, that wars are ultimately decided not just by armies but by the societies that sustain them, remains one of the most significant strategic lessons of modern conflict. The Confederate leadership's gradual, reluctant acknowledgement of this reality, documented in their private correspondence and internal memoranda, continues to influence military thinking to this day. In the final analysis, the American Civil War demonstrated how conventional metrics of military success could be rendered obsolete when one side transcends traditional calculations of victory and defeat. The Confederate leadership's recognition of this transformation, which emerged gradually throughout the war's final year, came too late to alter the conflict's trajectory, but provides crucial insight into how wars are won and lost, not just on battlefields, but in the minds of those who direct them. As military theorists and historians continue to study this aspect of the Civil War, the documents that record the Confederate High Command's evolving understanding of Northern resolve serve as a powerful reminder of how conflicts can be transformed when societies fully mobilize for war. The reluctant recognition that the fundamental premise of their strategy had been undermined, that the North would fight not as they had expected, but with a determination that transcended conventional military calculation, represents one of the most significant strategic insights to emerge from America's bloodiest conflict. Today, military strategists still examine this dimension of the Civil War as a case study in how wars are decided not just by tactical brilliance or resource advantages, but by the willingness of societies to bear whatever costs victory requires. The Confederate leadership's gradual realization of this harsh truth, documented in their private correspondence and internal memoranda, continues to inform our understanding of the nature of modern conflict. The final telegram, sent by Jefferson Davis to the remaining Confederate commanders on May 4, 1865, perhaps best captures this understanding. Despite the valor of our forces and the justice of our cause, we have confronted an adversary whose determination has proven stronger than anticipated. They have fought not merely with superior resources, but with the conviction that any sacrifice is justified to secure their objective. History may yet vindicate our principles, if not our assessment of Northern resolve. With these words, the Confederate leadership finally acknowledged the strategic miscalculation that had doomed their cause from the outset, the assumption that Northern society would behave as they had expected, seeking negotiated settlement when the costs of conflict became severe. Instead, they had encountered an opponent transformed for total war, willing to bear unprecedented sacrifices to preserve the Union. This realization, which emerged gradually throughout the war's final year, came too late to alter the conflict's outcome. By May 1865, the Confederate armies had surrendered, their government had dissolved, and their cause had been lost. Yet the insight they reached, that wars are ultimately decided not by armies alone, but by the societies that sustain them, remains one of the most significant strategic lessons of modern conflict. As military historians continue to study the Civil War's strategic dimensions, The documents that record the Confederate leadership's evolving understanding of Northern resolve provide invaluable insight into how conflicts are transformed when societies fully mobilize for war. The reluctant recognition that they faced not just Union armies, but a nation determined to accept any sacrifice rather than acknowledge defeat represents perhaps the most significant strategic insight to emerge from America's defining national conflict.